In every age, men have gone to war chasing shadows. Crowns that crumble, gold that glitters and fades, banners that once flew proud and now lay buried beneath the dust of time. But then there came a people who did not fight for the world at all. They fought for something the world could not see, something eternal. While kings sought glory carved in stone, these men sought the pleasure of the one who made the stars. Where others rode for fame, they rode for faith. Their swords gleamed not for empire, but for purpose. And when they marched, even the mighty trembled, because they carried not just steel. They carried conviction, they fought for glory. But the Muslims, they fought for God. There comes a moment in history when the clash of swords is not just the sound of war, but the sound of two worlds colliding, one fighting for the pride of men, the other for the pleasure of God. The desert winds carried no banners, no grand speeches, just dust, silence, and the footsteps of believers whose hearts beat in rhythm with eternity. Empires before them had fought for crowns, for conquest, for songs that would make their names immortal. But immortality to these men was not found in the praise of poets. It was found in the gaze of their Creator. They did not march to be remembered by men. They marched to be accepted by heaven. When the armies of Byzantium and Persia gathered, they did so in gold and glory, legions shimmering beneath the sun, their shields reflecting their pride. But from the deserts came warriors dressed in humility. No ornaments, no splendor, just resolve. They carried the dust of Medina on their sandals and the words of God upon their tongues. And when the two forces met, history itself seemed to hold its breath. For one side believed victory came from strategy, discipline, and steel. The other believed victory came from submission, not to kings, but to the Almighty. In those moments before battle, as the desert sun burned red across the horizon, you could see the difference written in their eyes. The Romans fought for Caesar. The Persians fought for their throne. But the Muslims, they fought for a prayer whispered beneath the stars. They fought for a message that had changed them from within. They remembered the prophet's words, that the true battle was not with the enemy before you, but the arrogance within you. And so they purified their hearts before they raised their swords. Each strike was not for revenge, but for justice. Each cry on the battlefield was not of rage, but of faith. When Khalid ibn al-Walid rode into battle, he did not ride for spoils or honor. He rode for a cause that outlived him. His sword was named the sword of God, not because it spilled blood, but because it defended truth. When Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas raised the banner at Qadisiyah, he knew that every step forward was not toward conquest, but toward destiny. The world could not understand them. How could men who owned so little command such fear? How could warriors who prayed between battles stand unshaken before empires? But the answer was simple. They had already conquered the greatest empire of all, their own desires. And when they charged, it was not madness that drove them, but serenity. In their hearts burned the unshakable belief that death was not the end. It was the beginning. For those who fought for the world feared its loss, but those who fought for God had nothing to lose at all. In the dust and chaos, amid the screams of men and the thunder of hooves, they remained calm. Their lips moved in remembrance, their eyes lifted to heaven. And when victory came, they fell at their knees, not in triumph, but in gratitude. That was the difference. Empires fought to rule men. They fought to serve God. And so while history remembers the empires that fell, it can never forget the faith that rose. The banners of kings turned to ashes, but the echo of Allah, there is no God but God, still rolls across the sands of time. For glory fades with the setting sun, but faith shines eternal. They say steel wins wars, that empires are forged by the sharpness of a blade and the discipline of armies. But history tells another story, a quieter one, carved not in iron, but in belief. For when the swords of Rome dulled and the banners of Persia burned, faith still stood, unbroken, unbent, unyielding. The world had never seen soldiers like these, men who smiled at death as if it were a doorway home. They were not bound by fear, nor tempted by plunder. Their hearts were their armor, and their faith, their shield. They were merchants, shepherds, farmers, not bred in royal courts or trained in marble halls. Yet when they heard the call of a come to success, come to prayer, they rose with a conviction that made kings tremble. They were not molded by strategy. They were forged in revelation. When the drums of war thundered across Arabia and the mighty empire scoffed at the thought of desert men challenging their thrones, they could not see what truly stood before them. For it was not an army that approached their borders. It was a movement of souls, At Yarmouk, when the Roman legion stretched across the horizon, their armor glinting beneath the sun, they believed victory was inevitable. But across the field stood men whose eyes held a light that no sword could extinguish. They had no fear of the empire before them, for they bowed to the Lord of all empires. They carried verses, not war cries. Their commanders reminded them that victory was not won by numbers, but by faith. One voice among them would whisper, "Stand firm, for paradise lies beyond that hill." And those words carried more power than 1,000 commands. When the clash began, steel met steel, and the desert roared with fury. Yet amid the chaos, they fought with a calmness that defied reason. The Romans fought for the world they could see. The Muslims fought for the world that waited beyond. Each strike they delivered was heavy with purpose. Each step forward was a declaration that faith could move mountains, that belief could crush empires. The ground beneath them was soaked in blood, but their spirit soared, unchained by fear, untouched by doubt. And when the dust settled, the mightiest army of its age lay shattered. The Muslims did not raise their banners in arrogance. They wept. For they knew victory was not theirs, it was God's. They were merely the instruments of His will. This was the power that steel could never command, the kind of strength that came not from the arm, but from the soul. It could not be forged in a smith's fire, only in the heart of a believer. The world saw this and struggled to understand. How could barefoot warriors bring down empires armored in gold? But faith, true faith, bends the laws of men. It gives courage to the weak and clarity to the lost. It turns the trembling hand into an unshakable one. For steel may pierce flesh, but faith pierces eternity. And so, when the empires wrote their victories in stone, the Muslims wrote theirs in the hearts of generations to come. Because steel rusts, but faith endures. On the battlefield, when the world around you is chaos, when arrows darken the sky and the ground trembles with the weight of war, there is one thing that holds a man together, the hand beside him, the brother who stands shoulder to shoulder, not out of obligation, but out of faith. They were not bound by kings, not chained by coin, not driven by promises of gold or land. No, these men were bound by something far greater. A bond that began in prayer and was sealed in sacrifice. Each one saw in the other not a comrade, but a reflection of belief. They were brothers in creed, soldiers of conviction, each heart beating in rhythm to the same sacred truth, that there is no God but God. And it was that unity, invisible yet unbreakable, that made them unstoppable. When the early Muslims stood upon the battlefields of Badr, their numbers were few. Barely 300 men faced 1,000, yet not one turned away. Why? Because they believed they were not 300, they were one. One heart, one purpose, one faith. When one fell, another stepped forward without hesitation, whispering a "Go, my brother, your reward is with him." And he would lift the banner not in pride, but in honor of the one who fell. They fought as if they shared a single soul, each one willing to give his life so the other could live to carry the message forward. This was not an army. It was a family born of faith. Their unity was their weapon. When the empires of the world fought, they fought as men competing for glory. But when the Muslims fought, they fought as brothers protecting a trust. Their victories were not measured in territory, but in loyalty. When Khalid ibn al-Walid stood before his men, he did not command them with the arrogance of a general. He reminded them as a brother. We are servants of God. We live for His word and we die for His promise. That was leadership, not through fear, but through love. A love that made men brave, not because they were unafraid to die, but because they could not bear to let their brothers fall alone. Even in the darkest hours, when the enemy pressed close, when their shields cracked and their horses stumbled, they would look to one another and find courage. They would whisper, "Hold fast, for beyond this struggle lies paradise." And those words would ignite their souls again. Empires have armies of strength, but faith builds armies of hearts, and then no empire on earth could break that. When victory came, they shared it as they shared everything else, with humility. No man claimed glory for himself, for he knew his triumph belonged to all. The rich ate beside the poor, the commander beside the common man. They were equals in worship, equals in war, equals in death. And when they buried their fallen, they did so not with mourning, but with pride. For each brother who departed left behind not emptiness, but inspiration. His sacrifice became a seed, and from it the garden of faith grew stronger. They were men who fought side by side, prayed side by side, and died side by side. And even centuries later, the brotherhood echoes through history, not as soldiers who conquered lands, but as believers who conquered themselves. For unity born of faith is a force no empire can divide. And the bond of brotherhood, forged in the name of God, is eternal. There are moments in time when the world changes, not with the fall of a king or the rise of an empire, but with the birth of light. A light that pierces through ignorance, injustice, and arrogance, and announces a new dawn. From the heart of the desert, that light rose. Not from palaces nor from thrones, but from the humble sands of Arabia, a land once forgotten, its tribes divided, its people lost in endless feuds. Yet from that dust, from those barren plains, came men who would change the course of civilization itself. They carried no crowns. They had no cities of marble or armies of gold, but they carried faith, faith so pure, so fierce, that it shattered the arrogance of empires. When Islam spread beyond the dunes, it was not conquest that first arrived. It was enlightenment. Wherever these believers went, they carried knowledge, mercy, and justice. They tore down idols not only of stone, but of oppression. They taught the world that might does not make right, that the strongest man is the one who controls his soul. The world had grown weary of kings who demanded worship. Persia had drowned in its luxury. Rome had rotted beneath its pride. And just when humanity stood on the edge of despair, a new message came. Simple, powerful, eternal. There is no God but God. That truth struck harder than any sword. It leveled kings and commoners alike. It freed slaves, elevated women, bound men together not by blood, but by belief. When the early Muslims entered lands once ruled by tyranny, they brought justice that astonished even their enemies. In Damascus, in Jerusalem, in Egypt, people found governors who prayed beside them, leaders who ate the same bread, judges who ruled without bribes. The people saw for the first time power without arrogance, authority without cruelty. It was as if the desert had given birth to a new kind of empire, one that sought not to dominate but to enlighten. The call to prayer echoed across lands that had known only the cries of war. Mosques rose where idols once stood. Schools replaced arenas of blood. The words of the Quran became the heartbeat of cities that had once lived in chaos. From Baghdad to Cordoba, knowledge flourished. Science, medicine, mathematics, they all found their roots in the soil of faith. The Muslims did not conquer to enslave. They conquered to liberate minds. It was the dawn of a civilization that saw no divide between the spirit and the world. Where faith inspired progress and progress honored faith. A world where men were not measured by their race or riches, but by their righteousness. Even those who opposed them could not deny the change. The Roman and Persian worlds that had ruled for centuries looked on in awe, for what they saw was not merely the rise of a people, but the rebirth of mankind's purpose. The deserts that once held silence now sang with the call of monotheism. The world that had once worshipped power began to bow before truth. This was not the dawn of another empire. It was the dawn of understanding. A civilization that began with prayer, built on justice and crowned with knowledge. And though centuries have passed, that light, the light that rose from Arabia, still shines. Empires fell, thrones crumbled. But that message, whispered beneath the desert sky, endures. For it was never meant for one people nor for one time. It was meant for the world. Time is a devourer of empires. It erases kings, silences legions, and buries monuments beneath the dust it scatters. The marble of Rome has cracked. The palaces of Persia lie in ruins. The empires that once called themselves eternal have turned to whispers in the wind. But there are legacies that time cannot touch. Legacies not carved in stone, but written in the hearts of men. The warriors who fought for God did not leave behind treasures or thrones. They left behind light. They left behind a way of life that outlived every dynasty, outlasted every conqueror. When the dust of war settled and the swords grew cold, their true victory began in the lives, the laws, and the love of generations to come. They built cities where knowledge was sacred and justice divine. In the great libraries of Baghdad, the observatories of Samarkand, the universities of Cordoba, faith and reason walked hand in hand. From them, Europe learned to think again, to question again, to dream again. Their call to prayer still echoes where once emperors' voices ruled. Their words, not of conquest, but of compassion, still move hearts long after their banners have faded from sight. While other civilizations fought to be remembered, the Muslims fought to be right before God. and that made all the difference. Their victories were not measured in the lands they held, but in the souls they awakened. A farmer in the plains of India, a scholar in Cairo, a merchant in Andalusia, all carried within them the same flame that burned in the hearts of those first believers. It was a flame no empire could extinguish. When the Mongols swept across the east, drowning cities in fire, even they, the destroyers of nations, were conquered by faith. When the Crusaders stormed the Holy Land, they met not savages, but men of discipline, mercy, and honor. When the world forgot the value of truth, the call of Islam reminded it once more. Their legacy was not bound by geography or blood, it was bound by belief. For while every empire sought to rule men, Islam sought to free them. And as the centuries passed, kingdoms rose and fell, dynasties burned and faded, but 5 times a day, across deserts, mountains, and seas, the same words ascend to heaven: God is greater. That is the legacy of those who fought for God. Their names may not be carved on every monument, but their spirit lives in every prayer, every act of charity, every whisper of peace. For glory dies with the body, but faith lives with the soul. History remembers men like Caesar and Alexander for what they conquered. But it remembers the believers, not for what they took, but for what they gave. They fought for no throne, no empire, no immortal fame. They fought so that the world would know its creator. And that is a victory no sword can win, and no passage of time can erase. For those who fight for glory fade into history, but those who fight for God live forever.